Okay, carrying on with part four here. I apologize for that last one. I'm not stopping. This is not anything, broadcast quality. This is not a really competent work because we are doing the best we can, and I'm not slowing down. I'm not going to go back and edit a video when I'm just throwing it up here. So sorry about that. My face disappeared. My video failed. In any case, I'm reading to you from page 234. He's come all the way from India to be a student at the University of Alexandria. Talking about Ghosh. I know him, said the Imam. He came around to ask me questions, but as for the student business, I don't know. What's he going to study? He doesn't even write in Arabic. And he doesn't. He just knows how to speak it. That's true, said the shopkeeper judiciously, but after all, he writes his own languages and he knows English. Oh, those, said the Imam scornfully. What's the use of those languages? They're the easiest languages in the world. Anyone can write those. He turned to face me now, and I saw that his mouth was twitching with anger and his eyes were shining with a startling brightness. Tell me, he said, why you worship cows. Taken by surprise, I began to stammer, and he cut me short by turning his shoulder on me. That's what they do in his country, he said to the old shopkeeper. Do you know? They worship cows. He shot me a glance from the corner of his eyes. And shall I tell you what else they do? He said. He let the question hang in the air for a moment, then announced in the dramatic hiss, they burn their dead. The shopkeeper recoiled as though he'd been slapped, and his hand flew to his mouth. Yallah, he muttered. That's what they do, said the Imam. They burn their dead. Then suddenly he spun around to face me and cried, why do you allow it? Can't you see it's a primitive and backward custom? Are you savages that you permit something like that? Look at you. You've had some education. You should know better. How will your country ever progress if you carry on doing these things? You've even been to Europe. You've seen how advanced they are. Now tell me, have you ever seen them burning their dead? A small crowd had gathered around us by now. Drawn by the Imam's voice and under the pressure of their collective gaze, I found myself becoming increasingly tongue-tied. Yes, they do burn their dead in Europe, I managed to say, my voice rising, despite my efforts to control it. Yes, they have special electric furnaces meant just for that. The Imam turned away and laughed scornfully. He's lying, he said to the crowd. They don't burn their dead in the West. They're not an ignorant people. They're advanced. They're educated. They have science. They have guns and tanks and bombs. Suddenly, something seemed to boil over in my head. Dilemmas and arguments I could no longer contain within myself. We have them too, I shouted back at him. In my country, we have all those things too. We have guns and tanks and bombs, and they're better than anything you've got in Egypt. We're a long way ahead of you. I tell you, he's lying, cried the Imam, his voice rising in fury. Our guns and bombs are much better than theirs. Ours are second only to the West's. It's you who are lying, I said. You know nothing about this. Ours are much better. Why, in my country, we've even had a nuclear explosion. You won't be able to match that in even 100 years. It was about then, I think, that Khamis appeared at my side and led me away, or else we probably would have stood there a good while longer, the Imam and I, delegates from two superseded civilizations, vying with each other to establish a prior claim to the technology of modern violence. At that moment, despite the vast gap that lay between us, we understood each other perfectly. We were both traveling, he and I. We were traveling in the West. The only difference was that I had actually been there in person. I could have told him a great deal about it, seen it firsthand. Its libraries, its museums, its theaters. He goes to the University of Cambridge. He goes to one of the top universities on the planet. But it wouldn't have mattered. We would have known, both of us, that all that was mere fluff. In the end, for millions and millions of people on the land masses around us, the West meant only this: science and tanks and guns and bombs. I was crushed as I walked away. It seemed to me that the Imam and I had participated in our own final defeat, in the dissolution of the centuries of dialogue that had linked us, India and Egypt. We had demonstrated the irreversible triumph of the language that has usurped all the others in which people once discussed their differences. We acknowledged that it was no longer possible to speak, as Ben Yiju or his slave, or any one of the thousands of travelers who had crossed the Indian Ocean in the Middle Ages might have done, of things that were right or good or willed by God. These things are gone. We'll talk about that. It would have been merely absurd for either of us to use those words, for they belong to a dismantled rung on the ascending ladder of development. Instead, to make ourselves understood, we had both resorted, I, a student of the quote-unquote humane sciences, and he, an old-fashioned village imam. We had both resorted to the very terms that world leaders and statesmen use at great global conferences, the universal, irresistible metaphysic of modern meaning. He had said to me, in effect, you ought not to do what you do, because otherwise you will not have guns and tanks and bombs. It was the only language we had been able to discover in common. And what is that language? The language of war, the language of domination, the language of power. That's all that matters. All this stuff about arts and civilization and learning and refinement and humanity, that's all out the window. All that has mattered since the 16th century, the 1500s, in the Indian Ocean, guns, tanks, bombs. That's his argument. And we'll learn about this. We'll learn about how it came about. In any case, so the Imam and Ghosh are trying to outdo each other with regard to whose country is better, and they conclude by resorting to the technology of modern violence. Why are we so hung up on violence? Well, we have to go back to Ghosh and Dhaka in 1964. So here we have to go to, back to our map. That's not it. Bangladesh is what we call it now. From 1947 to 1970, it was known as East Pakistan. So we had West Pakistan over here on the one side of India, west of India, and then we had East Pakistan over here. And these were just basically places where there was a majority of Muslim populated. The Muslim majority sort of hung out here, and so they created this Pakistan as a sort of a place for Muslims to feel more safe and consolidated outside of India proper, which was turning into. It had been ruled by Muslims, of course, for centuries, but now that the British were withdrawing, it would be democratic and it would be Hindu majority rule. So they created so where there were concentrated Muslims, even though there were plenty of Hindus living here in Dhaka. This is the homeland, the birthplace of Ghosh, where he comes from. But he is a Hindu, and so all of his people move across. It's West Bengal and East Bengal, Bangla. They speak the same language. It's basically the same ethnicity. But Kolkata, formerly Calcutta, is the city in India, which has plenty of Muslims living there. And then Dhaka is the city in Bangladesh, which had many Hindus living there, but there were a lot of population transfers. It was a very violent time. Ghosh is remembering the 1960s. Bangladesh was East Pakistan from 1947 until 1970. The two Pakistans were carved out of Hindu India as a homeland for the Muslims. The state of Bengal was divided into two. West Bengal became a state of India. East Bengal became part of East Pakistan, which is now called Bangladesh. Ghosh's family was a wealthy Hindu family from East Bengal, but they were targeted as quote-unquote outsiders, because they're Hindus, in 1964, just as Muslims in Calcutta were targeted by Hindu mobs on the other side of the border. So it's just partition. This is what you do when you build that wall in between the two groups. Then it introduces violence. This is always the case, whether we're talking about southern Germany and the Czech Republic in 1945. We're talking about India and Pakistan in 1947. Whether we're talking about Palestine and Israel after 1948. There's just a lot of violence involved with partitioning. But in any case, and Iraq, Baghdad after 2007, when they started partitioning that, there was a lot of violence involved there as well, and will be in the future. There's big giant walls throughout Baghdad separating the Shia from the Sunni neighborhoods. Okay, so even though in America we don't really partition, we do lots of partitioning in other places. Okay. So the Egyptian villagers couldn't understand Ghosh's reticence to talk about religion because theirs was a world that was far gentler, far less violent, very much more humane and innocent than mine. I could not have expected them to understand an Indian's terror of symbols. And it's true, India today is a much freer country than Egypt. People have democracy; they can vote their leaders in and out. They have freedom of speech; they can say whatever they want in their newspapers. That's not the case in Egypt, but Egypt is peaceful in a way that um, uh, India never has been. In Egypt, if if there's individual killings happen all the time, of course, but for the most part, Cairo has an incredibly low crime rate. And if you have a pogrom in a against Christians or something like that in a village somewhere, maybe 5 people or 10 people might get killed. A dozen or 2 dozen houses might get burned, that sort of thing. But in India, this is every day. They have a riot and 200 or 500 people are gone just like that. It's incredibly violent and has been for decades.